Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. Tonight, we are joined by Claudia Coulis and Ellen Letourneau, the authors of A Culinary History of Montgomery County. Tonight, they will be sharing with us all about their book and the way the history of the Ag Reserve has shaped local culinary tastes. We'd like to thank tonight's sponsor, the R. Edwin and Winsome S. Brown Foundation. Reminder, please remain muted during the presentation. You can send any questions you have throughout in the chat, and as always, there will be an opportunity at the end to unmute for Q&A. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, make sure to check out our website and register to join us again next week. Without further ado, Claudia and Ellen, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for having us. I'm gonna share my screen real quick. You know the routine, right? I just have to get into slideshow. Here we go. Okay, so today we're going to talk about two Montgomery County cooks, and they are featured in our book. Let me just, yeah, there we go. They're featured in our latest book, as Dottie mentioned, A Culinary History of Montgomery County. And so before we get into that book, I just want to tell you how we came to this. Our first project was Bread and Beauty. It was a cookbook about the agricultural reserve. And, you know, we profile farmers and producers out in the reserve. We talk about how it got there. And then it's a whole selection of seasonal recipes. But we did a lot of historic research for it. And we thought, you know, there are a lot of great stories here. And we thought it warranted another book. And luckily, the publisher agreed with us. So that's how we got to our current book. Culinary History of Montgomery County. What we do in this book is that we use foodways, which is the term for how we, you know, produce food and serve it and cook it and enjoy it and preserve it. Those are foodways, and we use those foodways in Montgomery County to understand the history of the county, the history of land use and transportation, and how they're all linked together. And so, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. There we go. And so, but first I want to talk a little bit about culinary history, because I think a lot of times people are unfamiliar with it as an approach, and maybe it gets overlooked because it's women's work and you think, oh, it's just cooking, or it gets overlooked because it's something we all do every day and we don't really examine it very closely. But food and culinary history is a great way to understand all kinds of things: technology, markets, the environment, politics, power. All those things are reflected in food. And so it's a really, I think it's a very nice way to really kind of relate to different communities through time and in our own in our own time as well. So that's the approach of culinary history. And one of the ways you do that, historians have learned to look at cookbooks. And so, you know, first you look at how the book was created, who put it together, how is it bound, who were the authors, who published it, where was it sold, who is the intended audience, how much money did it cost them to buy the book, and how literate were they? Those are all reflections of the community that is being served by cookbooks. And then, of course, you can look at the recipes as a complete collection. You know, what are they trying to get you to cook? Of course, today we see lots of health cookbooks, right? Or ethnic cookbooks of different cultures, and we look for authenticity. In the past, it wasn't really like that. Maybe they were looking for convenience or speed, or you know, these sort of bright colors and abundance. And so cookbooks can be very revealing of what people are trying to achieve when in their communities. And you know, we can it really gives you a deeper understanding of that community, the data day-to-day history of how they worked and who was entitled to power and pleasure and who was cooking. It's very revealing. And you can kind of see that approach if you look at our first, our cookbook, Bread and Beauty. How did we put that book together? Well, our point was to let people know about the Ag Reserve and what a beautiful place it was. And so we chose to do what some people have called the coffee table book. It's hardcover, it's big, it's lots of beautiful photos, because we wanted it to reflect the community and the place that the book was about. We always joke that there's no shrimp in the book. It's seasonal recipes. We wanted people to know that you can eat a lot of really interesting, different local food all year round. And so we wanted our audience to get a message about land, and we made the book to reflect that message. And that's the way cookbooks work. They're giving a message whether you realize it or not. And I want to give you a local example of that. These are the women of Camp Dismal. They lived in Sandy Spring, and every summer they would get themselves together and they would camp in an abandoned building that they could find. And their adventures were recorded by their self-appointed historian, Rebecca Miller. And she describes a trip that they took on July 14th in 1887. The temperature was 100 degrees. We can all relate, right? And they loaded up their wagon with rocking chairs, lamps, guitar, novels, wash bowls, and saucepans. They put up drapes and they decorated the mantelpiece of the building that they were in. And this picturesque cottage, as she describes it, was, she writes, uninhabited and empty, but for a colored woman, a mop, a pail, and a small boy. So it wasn't quite abandoned. It was available to these women for who had the luxury of roughing it. And so she describes also one of their lunches. They had roast lamb, cucumber pickle, scrambled eggs, Maryland biscuit, apple pie, molasses pie, and apple ice water. So you can see they were kind of enjoying, a break in their everyday lives. And one of the things that Rebecca Miller put together was the Dismal Camp Cookbook. And you can see this community wrote down a lot of records in Sandy Spring, the Quaker community. And you can see that this cookbook really reflects their sense of community, their ability to enjoy leisure time, and obviously their sense of humor as well. And so, you can see how a cookbook, and when you look at the binding and the paper, you can see they put it together themselves. It really is an expression of their personalities, which is charming to see, I think. So in our book, we try to tell the stories through time of the county's different communities, and we begin with the indigenous people in the county. And I think a lot of times when we think about indigenous diets, we kind of think of something kind of mean and lean, insects and acorns, but really these were communities that were thriving here tens of thousands of years, and you don't last that long without having a food culture that is very successful. And so and actually there's a historian, Waverly Root, who points out that the native diet, the indigenous people's diet, was probably more varied and excuse me, perhaps tastier than that of the settlers who came here from Europe. They certainly had access to protein that people in Europe wouldn't have unless you owned the land, and not many people did. So they had access to hunting and fishing and all kinds of foraging, and so it was a very varied and healthy diet. We in the book, each chapter comes with a historically inspired recipe, and we tried to choose ones that are cookable. And so this one is trout with sumac, and a Native American chef points out that this trout with sumac is something that you could eat almost anywhere in the US. Pretty much those two ingredients are available everywhere except the Southwest. So it's kind of a universal dish in a way, but of course there was lots of foraging, and these are things that we foraged right here in Montgomery County: milkweed, wild carrots, pawpaws. There's really hickory nuts. No, sorry, those are black walnuts, and so there's really a great deal of variety of food that was available. So that was one attitude toward land, sort of just taking what you need, preserving, moving through, having territories, but not ownership. That changed with the arrival of European settlers. This is a map from Baron von Graffenried, who came to Montgomery County. He was looking for silver or gold. And you can see he drew up in the upper right-hand corner there, he sketched Sugarloaf Mountain, which we kind of like, that the main landmark in Montgomery County has to do with food. So we thought that was kind of cool. But it was a very different attitude toward land. What could we get out of it and send back to Europe and make money off of? Is it furs? Is it minerals? What could we get? And of course, one of the things they grew was tobacco, and that was great as a cash crop. And but the problem was that tobacco takes all the nutrients out of the land, and you can't grow other crops. And so when the market for tobacco crashed, you really couldn't farm successfully in Montgomery County, and people went west to the Ohio Valley. And it's hard to imagine, but that Montgomery would become a synonym for poverty. But you read descriptions of fallen fence rows, abandoned houses. People were really literally going to greener pastures. And so farming really shifted west out into the Ohio Valley. So you need a way to get all that, the trade back and forth. And of course, one way that happened was the C&O Canal in Montgomery County, through Montgomery County. And the canal and the boats really have their own foodways, their own food culture, which we talk about in the book. Nobody grows beans in Montgomery County, but we had to include the bean soup. This is a recipe that Ellen developed. It's absolutely delicious, and it's the simplest thing ever. And you can kind of see why it was a standard on the boats, because you could have a sack of dried beans, you'd have some preserved meat, you'd have your barrel of water, you could pick up an onion, a tomato, or maybe some potatoes from the garden, from the gardens in the lock houses, because the lock house keepers would grow gardens and then sell produce to the passing boats. And you could get this soup going in the morning, all day long, tending your boat, tending your donkeys, and the soup is just bubbling away. And by the time dinner comes, you're all set. You don't have to start up fresh. And so it was kind of a standard on all the boats. And when they did arrive in Georgetown, they would treat themselves to a steak, apparently, but it was a pretty standard recipe. Oops, there we go. Now, the way fertility came back to Montgomery County was through the Quaker community. And they did all kinds of things like deep plowing and fertilizing. Because of the transportation connections, it was easier to get large quantities of fertilizer. It became less expensive and more available to farmers. And so Montgomery County farms slowly returned to became successful. And part of that success was based on technology, which is something that, of course, is universal. It's just our sense of what the latest technology is. That's what changes. Here's two examples. On the right is a corn planter that was created by Henry Blair, I think his name was. And he was an enslaved man who invented this. He was the first African-American man to get a patent. And you can see he clearly knew what he was doing. On the other side of the screen is Thomas More's invitation to Thomas Jefferson to examine his new invention. It's called a refrigeratory. And he came up with this thing to get his butter to market. So there's always this attention to markets and technology, and how can I, how can I get the food there to make more money? The patent office burned, and so the original patent documents for this are gone, but you can see in the lower corner there in the lower left, that's Jefferson's sketch. It's an oval wooden box. In it is set a tin box. It's surrounded by charcoal and ice, and then wrapped in wool and rabbit skin. And he recorded that he got his butter down Georgia Avenue to the market in DC. It was still hard, it was still cold, and he could charge more money for it as a result. And so, the approach to having technology in farms doesn't change. Now, of course, during the Civil War, Montgomery County is an interesting place. It's between North and South. It's kind of international. It's between the Tidewater and the German Penn Dutch farmstead. So it has a really kind of mixed food culture. But during the Civil War, of course, that dichotomy was very, very clear. And there are lots of interesting stories about farmers, depending on which side they were on, either being requisitioned and making some money from it, or being raided. And so it really depended how you viewed this. And and of course, slavery was part of this whole conflict. And so we included beaten biscuits here because it's a very Maryland dish, but it's very labor intensive. And I imagine in many households, it were the enslaved people who did that labor. The quote on the right is from, let me see his name, Charles Blake, and he was with the Vermont Infantry. And if you've ever been to Vermont, you know what the farmland is like up there. Very rocky, very hilly. So, Montgomery County's rolling fields must have looked very appealing to him. And this is a quote from a letter that he wrote his wife. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, he was killed in battle. And so he never did get to live in Maryland, but it's really interesting to see, the response of Northern soldiers when they came here down to the South. And of course, because, there are other wars, and food is always an issue during wartime. You've got to feed your soldiers, you've got to feed your community, and, and you have less labor to do it with. You've got to feed your allies as well. And so on the left there are the Farmerettes, who were recruited during World War I to replace the soldiers who had gone off to fight in the war. And it's to me, it's a very appealing story because, these are women who really, did a lot of things. And I think some people were surprised at how much they could do, driving the trucks to market, packing all these, all the produce for market. It really, it was really a change in our view of how labor and food work. And then, because Montgomery is so close to DC, during the war and the Depression, during the wars and the Depression, it often became kind of a laboratory for programs like this. And there are examples of that in the book. And then, of course, after the war, there was a different attitude toward food and land. And this is, some of you might remember the hot shops. You know, a farmer would look at land and say, you know, does it have water? Is it flat? Can I plow it easily? Do I have access to a road? You know, the farming, an agricultural estimation of land value is different than, you know, Marriott, who was expanding these hot shops. You know, he looked for property that was surrounded by you know, people. There were lots of people nearby. They had cars and they could get in and out of the property very easily. It was visible from a main roadway, and so he really changed how we think of land. It became a development commodity, really, and started this whole suburbanization. And of course, with suburbanization, you lose farms. And, you know, again, people start to eat differently. But now you all, I'm sure, out in Poolesville are familiar with the Ag Reserve, and that suburbanization, you know, people could see that change coming, and they didn't, you know, some of them thought it was progress and some of them were uncomfortable with it. And at that time, the planning department and the politicians thought, you know, we can manage to have both things, and it's valuable to have both things. So they set up the agricultural reserve, that green area. It's 1/3 of the county, 93,000 acres. And it has, and that was established in the 1980s. And it really has returned, we think, a lot of value to the county. It's a beautiful place. There is agriculture going on out there. There is, you know, parkland and recreation and respite. It protects our water supply. There's all kinds of history out there, of course. And so I always kind of think of it as this canvas for people to pursue their passions on these small farms and producing. And just the sketch on the right is a little diagram of how it was created. What happened was it was a rezoning, and it took the value of the development value from the farm and just transferred it down to a place like Bethesda or Wheaton or Silver Spring. And the idea was that you returned cash to the landowner in the ag reserve, and they still had their land and they could continue to farm. And you brought the development down into the down county, where you had already invested in things like roads and schools and parks and libraries. And so you were going to make the most of those public investments. So that is the kind of sweep of the book, and I've whipped through it because there are so many other stories that I haven't been able to cover. You know, there's the Farm Women's Market and all kinds of things that are in the book that you'll read about. But right now we want to focus on two people who are in the book and the cookbooks that they wrote, particularly because, again, as I mentioned earlier, these cookbooks really reflect the communities that they were in at the time they wrote the book. So first we have Elizabeth Ellicott Lee, and she was a member of the Quaker community in Sandy Spring. She moved there from, I think it was Delaware, when she married, and she lived, whoops, there it is, at Walnut Hill. This is her farm. This was her farm. Unfortunately, she was widowed very young. And so, you know, she was running this farm. It was an enterprise. You know, this was the way, this was a business, and she had to run it on her own after she was left a widow. And she was part of this very industrious farm community that was out there. As I mentioned, they returned fertility to the land. They were very technologically oriented. They gave a lot of attention to markets. They had some mills out there. And then also to education. They had schools and many, many, many betterment societies. And they recorded a lot, they shared a lot of information, which helped the whole community, and they recorded a lot of their successes and failures in the minutes of these meetings they had. And in fact, there were so many organizations. I'm going to read you. In 1919, the Annals of Sandy Spring recorded a series of meetings in October. The Mutual Improvement Association met on the 4th. The Home Interest Club met on the 6th. The Horticultural Society on the 7th. The Wednesday Club on the 8th. The Neighbors Club on the 9th, and the Enterprise Montgomery Farmers Club on the 11th. And so you can see this was a busy and sociable community. And at one point, a visitor commented, Sandy Spring can get up more occasions for fried chicken than any place I ever saw. There was always an excuse. All these meetings always came with a lunch, it seems. And so this picture is the hospital fundraiser out there for the hospital. And this is the fried chicken dinner in the 70s. And I understand that continued. It was an annual event that continued until just recently. So I'm sorry to see that go. But Elizabeth Lee wrote her book. She wrote she wrote her book to kind of record her own notes, like in her own, what she learned by running Walnut Hill. But she also, so she made first a copy as a bride, you would carry that with you to your new home. It was a very traditional thing to do. Then she made a second copy for her daughter because she didn't want her daughter to be left in the same situation that she was, away from family, having to run this enterprise on her own. And the book was first published by a Baltimore doctor, and then it was taken on by a publisher, and it went through 19 printings. So it was really a very popular book. And the interesting thing to me is that it wasn't mentioned in her obituary, and she died in 1858. And I often wonder why, like, was it modesty, or did everybody just kind of know that she had done that, written this very successful book? Or was it, at the same time, the style of food that she cooked really had changed. When it was very sturdy farm cooking, and more people were living in urban environments and could get a lot of the things like the bread and the prepared foods. They could get it from a market, and they didn't have to know how to do it. So I often, that might be part of it. It was, as I said, it was very sturdy, and she gave attention, which was interesting, to all the different produce, because a lot of times it was just assumed that you knew what to do with your produce, but she was making a record. It's a handbook really for how to run your household. And so she included all that produce. Some of the things she includes are pig's head, rabbits, game, and beef. There's a lot of information on how to preserve things, either to dry it, salt it, preserve it in alcohol, pickles, because that was important. You had to preserve food to get your family through the entire year. And she also has information on it's a household manual, how to run a calm and successful household. Whoops, let me go back one. And so, she tells you things like, this makes sense to me today. She just lay it all out in the morning, the night before, and then in the morning you're ready to go. And so she really gives a lot of that kind of advice as well. Her recipes are very terse. She gets right to the point. There are no measurements. That didn't come along until a little bit later. And so they're as complete as the book is, there are a lot of assumptions as well, that you know what you're doing with certain things in the book. And it really is a household manual. She includes medicines and cleaning advice. She includes information, advice on dealing with help around the house. She did not own slaves. She was a Quaker. And so her attitude toward household help was a little bit different than other cookbook writers at the time. And, she also talks about charity. That's the interesting thing, because her attitude was that if you run an effective household and you're thrifty, it can be a joyful place, it can be a calm place, but it can also be it can generate surplus that you can then share in charity, which was a very Quaker notion. And so that's what she was really encouraging you to do. Be efficient so that you can share your good fortune with others. It's a lovely attitude, I think. Now, she was out in Sandy Spring on the east side of the county. On the west side of the county was Maria Brooke Watkins, and she came along a little bit later. She was a young woman during the Civil War, and her family had a farm along the Potomac River, which was an encampment for the 1st Maine Artillery. And she was a Southern sympathizer. She learned to shoot because people would come to her farm and try to steal the chickens. And so she was quite, she was very protective of her property. But of course, and she was a Southern sympathizer. And this is Commander Howard Shaw of the 1st Maine Artillery. And what he wrote is that Maria Brooke Watkins was convinced that all this fuss and war, this loss and suffering, and this excitement was due to the wild imaginings, perverse distractions, and evil intent of Northern Yankees. And so you can see she had a very different attitude. But think about it. She's a young woman. There are a lot of handsome soldiers in their uniforms. Their band plays for the family. She goes out riding with them and their wives, and they dine together. And so her attitude, I think, really changed toward the soldiers. And as Shaw wrote, she was a loyal Unionist. This was many years later, and she had fond memories of the 1st Maine during the Civil War. Now, when she married, she moved into the Bethesda area. Her husband, Spencer Watkins, had land that was between I think it was north of Bradley Lane, between Wisconsin and Connecticut, in that area there. And in fact, his neighbors, the Dodges, gave some of their land for St. John's Church, which is right at the corner of Bradley and Wisconsin. And so this cookbook she took on this cookbook as a fundraiser for the church. And this, just the way Elizabeth Ellicott Lee's book, their handwritten book, was part of a tradition. These books also, these more published books, also became very traditional. And, I'm sure you've seen those comb-bound church cookbooks or, school cookbooks. This is sort of the beginning of that. And what's interesting to me about this one is the reason it started, first of all, as a tradition, is that the Union was really struggling to raise money for sanitation and medical supplies. And so communities began holding these sanitary fairs. And at one of them, someone collected recipes into a cookbook. It was in 1864 in Philadelphia, and it was called A Poetical Cookbook, and it was a big hit. And so other places started doing this. And 3,000 of these books were published between 1864 and 1922. And the interesting thing about this is that what historians have found is that as women started taking their domestic skills into the commercial arena, which is what they were doing, and earning money, they had to gain new skills. They had to market these cookbooks. They had to marshal a crew of people to put it together. They had to deal with the publisher and make sure they were getting a good deal. And then they had to sell the books. And then you bring the money to the table of this organization and you have a louder voice in decision making because you're bringing money into the group. The other thing that's interesting about this cookbook, I think, is that you can see that it's part of a template. There are other up-to-date cookbooks of tested recipes. One is from Kenton, Ohio, and it's basically done in the same format. It has a similar list of household tips. And, if you've ever come across the Morris Press today, it's the same idea. Take your recipes, dump them into a template, and let us do the work for you. So that's an example of this. And then, of course, when you look at the collection and the recipes themselves, you start to see some changes from Elizabeth Ellicott Lee's book. So, for example, on this one page, you have the second recipe down is Owendaw cornbread. That's a cornbread. It's kind of like a spoon bread that's made. There's no leavening in it. It's leavened with eggs, and it's made with cooked grits and cornmeal. And it was, in fact, that recipe is in Mrs. Robert E. Lee's personal cookbook. So you can see it's a very Southern and a kind of old-fashioned recipe. But at the bottom of the page, there's a new flannel cake, which includes baking powder. And so that, and I think that's where the new comes from. You have this new product, baking powder. You don't have to make yeast. You don't have to beat eggs, for over and over to get leavening. You have this new chemical that can help you make a nice light bread. And so she's really, she's sort of in between those two traditions. Now, the other recipes in here, they're very Maryland. There's crab in various preparations, no crab cakes, however. And then, of course, you have the Southern influence as well, as in the Owendaw cornbread. And so part of this notion of being up to date and tested, that was very much of the time. That there was this kind of scientific approach to the kitchen. Catherine Beecher wrote a household manual that tried to make all these things very orderly and a kind of a scientific approach to running your household. And the idea was that your husband would be going off to the office and in a very kind of orderly new kind of business, and you would be home running your household the same way. Another food historian, Laura Shapiro, writes that American cooks were struck with a culinary idealism, and that tested recipes would ennoble household work with scientific principles. And, these aren't cooks. They really are reflecting community life. These aren't cooks that have to fill a root cellar to get their family through the winter. And they want to make elegant and stylish dishes too. There's an element of display, and you want to impress people. And so you have these things are kind of arranged on plates, and they're put in little patty shells or lettuce cups and things like that. Of course, so this is a very elegant recipe. Of course, this recipe, it's cream turkey. It's also a time-honored way to use leftovers, isn't it? Right? You chop up the leftover meat, you put a sauce in it, you give it some new display, and you suddenly have a new book. So there's a new dish. There's a very practical approach to this as well. And the other interesting thing about this cookbook is it really does have a wider reach. You can see here there are Cuban recipes. This is not something that Elizabeth Ellicott Lee would have included in her book. So people were traveling and they were eating different things. I think one of the most disturbing recipes in this book is Macaroni Al Italian. You take 12 sticks of macaroni in a sauce of cream, butter, flour, milk, and cheese, spiced with mustard and paprika. And the woman who donated the recipe offers this advice: as it is awkward to serve macaroni in unbroken sticks, some prefer to break the sticks before boiling, but the true Italian way is to serve with unbroken sticks. So you can see, even then, authenticity was an issue. I would say kind of contentious issue. So you're not really cooking to survive here, but really to, to maybe to show off a little bit as well. This was really a changing community. And, talk about showing off. Here's a recipe for pâté de foie gras sandwiches. And if you couldn't get the pâté, they suggest caviar could be a reasonable substitution. And of course, there were many lovely groceries right down in Washington that could supply this sort of thing for you. This is not something Elizabeth Ellicott Lee had at her fingertips. And the interesting thing about this book is that none of the advertised businesses are in Montgomery County or in Bethesda. They are all in DC. And of course, in later books that would change. And you can see that reflected, this changing community as the economy shifts. And of course, we're in a changing community now. We have many more, we have different ethnic communities than were here before. We're lucky enough to have the farms, and we can share this bounty with our neighbors, some of whom don't have as much as we do. So again, this food culture, it's with us today. It's something that when you look around, you see that it's a very distinct thing. So that is our a quick look at our book, and I'm glad to answer any questions if you have any. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing now.
Distributed the work for the book. Hi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I was wondering how you two coordinated and sort of broke down the work of your book.
How we coordinated on what?
On how you did the work on your book. Like, did you write one chapter and she wrote the next chapter, Ellen? Or did you do the research and you do the writing, or vice versa, or whatever? I'm just
Well, we share the work, and there's so much more than writing that goes into a book.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and so I tend to do a little more of the research and writing, and Ellen is on the production side, I'd say. And she edits for me and tracks things down, and then really keeps track of everything that I can't stand to do. So lucky.
The reason I was interested is I am a copy editor by trade. I'm retired now, but I didn't hear a word out of Ellen. I'm like, so Ellen, tell us a little bit more about what you did, kind of thing. Because we copy editors are always in the background. But you guys couldn't spell without us, really. That's good. The grammar and the spelling is all us. But this sounds really interesting. I'm definitely going to get this book. I'm very interested in it.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
I found this so fascinating that I want to run up and get the book also. But it makes me think, like, my dad especially was a fabulous cook, and I have all these old recipes copied on papers that my sisters, it makes me want to put like it all together for like my kids and grandkids. Like we never bought store-bought rolls. Like my dad always made them, so you always had the smell of the yeast, and like all the bakery goods, everything. So it just is really kind of inspiring me to go in my cabinet and pull all that out and start.
When my son went off to college, it's sort of breaking up. When my son went off to college, I made him a cookbook. And, it's got like family recipes in here and like pictures of, it keeps breaking up, pictures of him with his cousins and my mother and my grandmother. And it really, I don't think he uses it, but I know he has it. And at some point he'll really cherish it.
Yeah, that's a treasure. It really
Yeah.
is. It makes me feel like what a treasure I have that my parents left all those recipes for us.
It is.
Yes.
It is a treasure.
Yeah, it seems to be that making cookbooks must be, I don't know, in a trend right now or what? Because my husband made a cookbook for our daughter for Christmas,
Oh.
and it's, you know, it's about 20, 30 recipes in it that she had to have. He had to write them down. It's very nice to be able to hand down recipes from generation to generation. I don't have much from my past, but I have a recipe that my grandmother wrote down for my sister, and I have a copy of it hanging in the kitchen here in my house, because it used to be my favorite recipe. We used to love this dish she made, and so now it's a bit complicated to make, because she doesn't really, like in the olden days, she doesn't really give measurements. She says a little bit of this, a little bit of this, add some butter, get good butter. It has to be good butter. It has to be good flour, whatever that means. And then it will work. But yeah, I really enjoyed this talk. So now I will be running out for the book. I have the Bread and Beauty, but now I have to go this one too.
Good.
We'll be at Locals tomorrow.
Thank you.
Welcome. Do we have any written questions?
Just as a point of fact for people, if they go to look for the book at Locals, there is a room kind of in the back. You don't see it. We were there every week since they opened, and we only saw it like 2 weeks ago. So there's like this little secret room where they have the book. Ask. You have to ask at the counter.
I wanted to know about your bean recipe.
Yeah.
So, how many trials did you did you make till you got it the way you wanted it?
Oh my goodness. That's a really good question. And it's been a while since it was in development, because I think we originally were working on that during Bread and Beauty. So
Yeah.
it's been a while. One of the things that was really fun was as we were testing recipes, friends would ask for the recipes before they were published, and we would send them along, and they'd have, unbeknownst to us, have potluck dinners where each person took on one of the recipes,
Oh,
made it together, and reported back to us what they thought.
Yep.
And the bean soup, I think it's one of those nice recipes that it if you've got ingredients, it's malleable. If you've got a nice broth going, and you can put whatever you have on hand, so some meat and potatoes and beans, and I think it's just kind of to taste, really, and something that can simmer for a while, and you can add to it, and it doesn't need to be the same thing every time. It just has some very basic staple ingredients. And I think it grew out of something that I do when the tomatoes are coming in, or and have some homemade chicken broth on hand, and just start to build a stew. So it's very flexible in that way. And as Claudia said, if you were going down the canal, or a neighbor of yours brought something from the garden, you could just add that to it, and it could take you through some seasons too. So I think, I can't remember specifically the steps, but I think it was one of those more organic developments.
so I wanted to know, like, did you use like cannelloni beans or northern beans, or did it matter?
I don't remember it mattering. And
Yeah.
is the recipe in Bread and Beauty, Claudia? It's been a while since
Yeah,
I
and
even
it's
looked.
in this one too. So it's
Oh
in,
gosh.
yeah.
Oh, the actual recipe is here? I'm sorry, I haven't read my book cover to cover yet.
Well, you can see I can't even remember what's in it. So and I must have read it about 100 times.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in there.
All right, I
Yeah.
will look for it.
Yeah. Oh,
And then you can report back to me.
It's on page 70.
yeah.
All right, page 70 for the bean recipe.
Yeah.
For it. Awesome, thank you.
I wanted to ask you, Bread and Beauty
is such a beautiful treasure. I live in Barnesville, and so it's nice to see you again, Ellen.
Hi, Carol.
But I have gotten it and given it a gift to a number of people, and this looks like it's going to be equally as special a book to anybody in the area. So are you thinking about your next project, or do you have one, or dare I ask?
Well, I'm intrigued by the ladies of the Dismal, the Camp Dismal ladies. I'm intrigued by them, and there are a lot of journals, so I think I might want to look into those. We'll see.
Wonderful.
If you have a cherished family recipe, one thing that we've been doing in our family, there's a company, ST Woodshop on Etsy, that takes your recipe and puts it on a cutting board, etches it in.
Nice.
So this is my mother's handwriting when she's passed away, and we give it to our siblings and also to the grandkids for our cherished recipe of grandma. And then I don't actually cut anything on here. I just have it sitting on a plate stand in the kitchen, but it's a nice way to kind of memorialize a recipe that is a favorite for the family.
Yeah, and on Etsy, the people are Southern Traditions Workshop Ltd. If you want to look them up, they can do that for you.
Oh, that's great. That's lovely.
And you send an image of whatever it is. It could be a picture too, and then pick what size cutting board you want, and then they make the cutting board for you.
Oh, that's nice. I may have to get on Etsy.
And as interesting as that is, Dottie, I think Dottie wrote an article for us at one point about people who had recipes put on their gravestone.
Really?
Wow.
And it said, like, I said I was taking this to my grave. And I did.
Literally.
Oh my God. I kind of love that.
You do.
But they didn't, like you're talking about, they didn't put measurements. They just had, you know, the things you put in it with no measurements. But
Yeah. Yeah.
If anybody knows what a dollop is quantitatively, I would like to know.
Is that a tablespoon? A
Is
dollar?
it?
I would say it's bigger than a tablespoon. It's big enough to make a dollop noise when you drop it.
Oh.
Is it like an ice cream scoop?
Ooh.
That size?
I think it depends on your appetite.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Isn't there like a mayonnaise that uses that in their, oh no, a sour cream thing that says use a dollop of daisy? So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's probably
That's a commercial. Yes. That's a commercial.
So then what is a dollop?
It was supposed to be
Well, I
You'll
can
have to
report
watch
back
the
in later.
commercial.
What is it?
Marion, you're gonna have to watch the commercial when it's on.
No, I won't.
Oh,
If
I've
we
just
have
looked
any
it up.
more
It says a
questions-
shapeless mass or blob of something.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for
You're welcome.
clarification.
Anytime.
It's
how-
been
that's how
on
I
for a
would describe
while.
it's not a particularly precise measurement.
It's
Do you have
probably
any more
just.
questions?
It looks like somebody has made a comment in the chat. My husband bought the book when you were at Kaliva. He was so inspired about the hot shops that he made the Mighty Mo burger, and it was delicious. Thank you for moving him into the kitchen.
Uh-huh.
Hamburgers will do that. They get men into the kitchen. Whenever, my husband, he took some of the photos for the book, and, I said, okay, we have to do the Mighty Mo. Oh, no problem. Clear the decks. I'm ready.
So I grew up, hot shops was a huge part of growing up in downtown Silver Spring. And so for our 50th high school reunion, we had all hot shops catered by Marriott. Mighty Mo, French fries with gravy. You remember
Oh,
that? Yeah.
How about the teen twist? That was my
Yeah.
favorite.
The teen twist.
Yeah. That was like ham and cheese on a twist roll. Twisted
Oh,
roll.
that's great.
Secret sauce. So,
Oh, yeah, I might have the secret sauce recipe.
yes, Vicky was asking, do you really
Yeah.
have the secret sauce recipe?
Yeah,
It's in here. It's in
It's
the
in the
book.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, fascinating.
oh,
Oh, good.
well, you have given us so much food for thought tonight, and I mean that like literally and figuratively. So thank you so much.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
absolutely. I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. As always, if you think of any questions later, you can email us at info@poolsvilleseniors.org and we'll pass them on for you. If you'd like to unmute or turn your camera on to say goodbye, now's the time. We'd like to thank Claudia and Ellen for their presentation tonight. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. As always, you can go to our website at poolsvilleseniors.org for more info and registration. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We loved
Good
having
night,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.